Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for 30 years. He built an empire larger than any from the Tsarist era, and is possibly one of the most successful rulers since the Tsars. However, he also became one of the most controversial dictators in history. Rising from the ranks of the revolutionary movement, Stalin transformed a devastated country into a nuclear superpower. Yet, the tools of his progress were terror, enslavement, and executions, viewing the people merely as instruments to serve his goals. During World War I, Russia, under the authoritarian Romanov dynasty, suffered a crushing defeat on the battlefield and faced economic collapse, causing Tsar Nicholas II's control over power to weaken. Russia seemed ripe for revolution. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by revolutionary leader Lenin, stormed the Winter Palace and took over the country. A new government based on Marxism began a civil war to consolidate its control. The Civil War was a hard-fought struggle for the survival of the Bolshevik Revolution. After Lenin's death, Stalin gradually emerged as the leader among the high-ranking figures fighting for power, becoming the dictator of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, born in 1878, was not Russian but Georgian. He grew up in poverty in a border province of the Russian Empire. Standing only 5 feet 4 inches (1.62 meters), he had a Napoleon complex from a young age and never admitted to any wrongdoings, driven by his overwhelming confidence. Stalin was educated at a Russian Orthodox seminary and could have become a priest, but he chose a different path. During his time at the seminary, Stalin became an atheist and began studying Marxist writings. The German social philosopher Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, was causing a stir in radical European circles. His ideas inspired Stalin to realize that revolution could overthrow the Tsarist regime. This was a young man filled with ideals, seeking a cause, communism. At the age of 20, Stalin left the seminary and joined the Marxist movement in Georgia, becoming a political activist. Trying to overthrow the Tsarist regime was an extremely dangerous task, as the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, were hunting down subversives. To avoid capture, revolutionaries had to frequently change their identities and residences. Stalin, driven by idealism, began organizing industrial workers to subvert the Tsar's regime under the name Koba, the Georgian Robin Hood. He then went to the port city of Batumi on the Black Sea, where thousands of workers were employed. Stalin quickly orchestrated a series of strikes. It was in Batumi that he first truly experienced the taste of leadership. In 1902, during a strike he led, a clash with the authorities resulted in police opening fire, killing 15 and injuring several others, while Stalin emerged unharmed. This strike was a revelation for Stalin. He saw a way forward through bloody conflict and realized that this was how he could change Russia and propel the revolutionary movement. Stalin saw violent conflict as key, and his actions attracted widespread attention, ultimately leading to a meeting with Lenin, the leader of the movement. To Stalin, Lenin was the eagle of the revolution, as well as his mentor in practice. Stalin's loyalty to Lenin and his devotion to the cause left a lasting impression. For the revolution, Lenin gave Stalin an important task: raising funds. He went to the prosperous port city of Baku, where, far from the Tsar's power core, he became a gang leader, extorting capitalists and running casinos and brothels to raise money. This was a demonstration of Leninism's core principle: revolution was the only goal, no matter the means. By this time, Stalin was a wanted criminal on the Tsarist secret police's list. By 1906, Tsar Nicholas II's regime was crumbling. After frequent strikes, economic turmoil, and revolutionary waves, he was forced to abdicate and establish the Duma, a parliamentary body. Though the Bolshevik Party gained several seats in the Duma, Stalin remained a fugitive, spending years in prison and labor camps. His friend Malinovsky became the leader of the Bolshevik faction in the Duma. In 1912, Stalin successfully escaped exile and went to the capital, seeking a safe base. He immediately visited his friend Malinovsky. Stalin trusted Malinovsky deeply, which proved to be a huge mistake. Malinovsky was actually a high-level double agent bought by the Tsarist secret police. He invited Stalin to a fundraising dinner, which turned out to be a trap, and Stalin was arrested and exiled once again. This betrayal had a profound psychological impact on Stalin, making him wary that even the closest, most loyal, and most steadfast communists could betray him. This would later set the stage for the Great Purge. Stalin was exiled to the Arctic Circle in Siberia for 4 years, in a harsh, frozen wilderness where food was scarce and wolves roamed every night. These wandering wolves haunted Stalin's mind throughout his life. He often drew fierce wolves in his graffiti, showing sharp teeth, ready to pounce. His close associates later remarked that Stalin exhibited a wolf-like quality, perhaps rooted deep within him. This was more than a metaphor. It was a reflection of his savage nature. When the Bolshevik Party took power in 1917, Stalin returned to Moscow, ready to claim a place in the communist government under Lenin's leadership. He came back to the capital with a cold mentality forged through years of struggle. To him, violence was not just a means to an end, but the end itself. Only by completely destroying the enemy could victory be achieved. The rising dictator shed his old name and officially became Joseph Stalin, meaning man of steel. Stalin was one of Lenin's most trusted leaders and a member of the Central Committee, though he was neither the most experienced nor the most popular member. When Lenin assigned high-ranking positions, it appeared that Stalin's competitors in the party had secured the best roles. Stalin, feeling dissatisfied by his lack of academic and intellectual stature compared to Lenin and Trotsky, began plotting his own rise to power. Trotsky, given control of foreign affairs and the Red Army, made a critical mistake, underestimating Stalin's abilities. He failed to realize that once Stalin seized power, he would carry out a purge to eliminate rivals. Kamenev, a former teacher, was tasked with managing Moscow and became Lenin's deputy. The traditional Marxist intellectuals didn't value Stalin, unaware of his true capabilities. However, Lenin, recognizing Stalin's organizational talent, appointed him to the administrative position of General Secretary, a post at the time no one wanted because it appeared insignificant. While Trotsky and Kamenev were basking in the political limelight, Stalin was dealing with the mundane tasks behind the scenes. But he quickly realized that the General Secretary held power. He controlled the agenda, who attended meetings, and what was discussed. The new Soviet Union was run by committees, and controlling the agenda meant controlling everything. So, Stalin gradually took control of the appointments, placing his people in key positions. If he could secure a majority in the Central Committee, he would be the top leader. As Lenin and his high-ranking team dealt with the challenges of a war-ravaged and oppressed country, Stalin was building his power base, always ready to take revenge on those who had previously underestimated him. Anyone who insulted Comrade Stalin would soon find their days numbered. In 1924, Lenin died of a stroke. Stalin and other leaders accompanied Lenin's body to its final resting place. However, Trotsky, a key figure, did not attend. Stalin deliberately changed the date to prevent Trotsky from coming. In Trotsky's absence, Stalin delivered a eulogy, claiming that everything they had achieved was due to Lenin's greatness and that he had devoted himself entirely to Lenin's cause, subtly positioning himself as Lenin's heir. Although Stalin was officially only General Secretary at the time, he had garnered enough support to establish himself as Lenin's successor. Now, he could begin taking revenge on those who had once belittled him. Trotsky was the first target exiled abroad and eventually murdered in Mexico. 5 years after Lenin's death, Stalin celebrated his 50th birthday, by then firmly in control of the highest leadership of the Soviet Union. Despite 10 years of communist rule, the country was still deeply underdeveloped. Stalin believed the Marxist remedy was needed to rejuvenate the country, starting with resolving the agricultural problem. In December 1929, he launched a class struggle against the wealthy peasants, ordering their elimination as pests. Under the guise of liberating the peasants, he forced them to work on large collective farms. To accelerate the Soviet Union's industrialization, the government seized grain from the peasants, providing it to city workers and using it as propaganda to portray collectivization as a great victory. However, the reality was the opposite. Authorities wrongly predicted that agricultural collectivization would lead to a significant increase in output, leading to the forced requisition of seed grain and the peasant stores of food for survival. Despite repeated requests from local governments to reduce grain quotas, the central government refused, ultimately causing widespread famine. Stalin may have anticipated the famine, but he did not expect it to claim the lives of around 10 million people. By 1933, cannibalism had become widespread across southern Russia in what was the most horrific man-made famine in history. Stalin regarded it as the price of revolution, once stating that the death of one person was a tragedy, but the death of a million was just a statistic. Bolsheviks like Stalin, with their cold, detached, and ruthless demeanor, are truly chilling. As he once told Lenin, his hands would not tremble while carrying out the tasks at hand. These facts only came to light after Gorbachev's rule and the collapse of the Soviet Union. News of the famine was suppressed in the cities, but rumors leaked out. One evening, Stalin held a dinner at the Kremlin with his second wife, Nadezhda. He was deeply concerned about anyone knowing about the famine, especially his own family, fearing it might make them think he had betrayed the peasants' cause. However, Nadezhda had already heard the rumors of how severe the famine had become. Nadezhda stood up and left the room, walking out without a glance. She was deeply upset. Later, she wrote a letter condemning Stalin, expressing her inability to accept the collectivization policies and the persecution of the peasant class. This was undoubtedly a direct challenge to Stalin, and she chose the only way to express her discontent: suicide, using her life to defend her beliefs and refusing to let anyone question Stalin. Her death was undoubtedly a challenge to Stalin's authority. Stalin was furious, claiming she had left as an enemy. Her death was reported as appendicitis. Afterward, Stalin became more reclusive and paranoid, and the Great Terror was about to begin. In January 1934, Stalin convened the highest decision-making body of the Soviet Union, the Party Congress, the largest meeting of Soviet leaders in 4 years. Among those gathered was Stalin's loyal supporter Sergei Kirov, whom Stalin considered his closest friend and personally appointed to the role of Leningrad Party Secretary. However, Stalin grew increasingly concerned about Kirov's popularity within the party, fearing that one day he might become a rival or betray the revolution like Malinovsky. Stalin feared Kirov might gather strength within the party to oppose him, and to him, if someone posed a potential threat to his power, friendship and loyalty meant nothing. If he saw Kirov as a threat, he would not hesitate to eliminate him. On December 1, 1934, Sergei Kirov walked into his office in Leningrad for the last time. His assassination marked the beginning of Stalin's purge. Stalin seized the opportunity to eradicate all potential rivals. First, he arrested Kamenev, Lenin's former deputy, and his supporters, accusing them of treason and blaming them for Kirov's death. Kamenev held a prestigious position in the party as one of Lenin's original team members. Stalin had to prove to the Soviet people that these accusations were true, so he declared that the arrested individuals were anti-Leninists, hiding within the organization and plotting a coup to seize the revolution's Kangua. To give credibility to the absurd accusations, Stalin demanded confessions. Kamenev and other senior party officials were brought to the Kremlin from prison. Stalin offered them an ultimatum they could not refuse. If they complied with his orders, their families would be safe. To protect their families, they chose to compromise. Stalin then had Kamenev and 15 other senior party officials stand trial, with foreign reporters allowed to observe. It was more of a spectacle than a trial. The defendants confessed, but the trial did not proceed immediately. Eventually, Kamenev and the other accused conspirators were executed, while lower-ranking individuals were simply arrested and executed. In 1936, Stalin decided to launch the Great Purge, a campaign mainly carried out by the secret police of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. The purge first targeted the central leadership, old Bolshevik government officials, and local party committees. Of the 45 members of the Central Politburo, only 11 survived. The purge expanded to include the Soviet Red Army and its commanders, which had a profound impact on the military. Among the Red Army, 3 marshals, 13 of the 15 Army Group Commanders, 8 of the 9 Admirals, 50 of the 57 Army Generals, 154 of the 186 Division Commanders, and all 16 Army Political Commissars and 25 of the 28 Military Political Commissars were executed during the Purge. This led to severe shortages of leadership in the Soviet Army during the early stages of the German invasion, causing the Red Army to collapse, with Nazi forces nearly reaching Moscow. One notable detail is that the purge of the Red Army was sparked by forged documents transmitted by Czechoslovakian President Beneš, forged by Reinhard Heydrich of the Gestapo. These documents contained correspondence between Red Army Marshal Tukhachevsky and high-ranking German officials. This indicated that the Germans had a deep understanding of Stalin's background and knew his paranoid nature. It also validated the saying that how a person thinks often leads them to project their thoughts onto others. As the purge grew in scope, its impact spread to the lives of ordinary citizens. The People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs began purging minority groups, such as the Volga Germans, who were forcibly deported and subjected to harsh repression, imprisonment, torture, and arbitrary executions. This became a regular occurrence at the time. By March 1938, Stalin declared that internal enemies had been eliminated, and the Great Purge was largely over. Stalin then began criticizing the mass executions carried out by the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Although he knew too many people had been killed, he could not admit it. So the People's Commissariat became a scapegoat, with its leaders Yagoda and Yezhov ordered to be executed. Within just 2 years, scholars estimate that around 700,000 people were killed during the Great Purge. The People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs reported 681,692 executions, with another 1,372,382 arrested for various political reasons. During the Great Purge, each province and city was assigned a specific arrest quota, and the authorities only cared about meeting the numbers, without considering who was arrested. 4 high-ranking party members sentenced to death. Stalin personally signed the execution orders, often leaving comments like scum or deserving of death, deriving satisfaction from this cruel game of power. At this point, Stalin had become a psychopathic ruler, obsessed with power and even indifferent toward children. Children were taught to be loyal to Stalin, seeing themselves as Stalin's children rather than their parents' children. If parents expressed dissent toward Stalin, children were encouraged to report them to the teachers. Ultimately, many children turned in their parents. Fear was at the heart of everything, planting seeds of mistrust in every corner of society, with personality cults reaching their peak. Stalin had effectively become the new Tsar of the Soviet Union, and outside the USSR, a new enemy was rising. Adolf Hitler was as ruthless and disdainful of humanity as Stalin, his sole purpose being the destruction of communism. However, in 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a pact to divide Poland and promised not to attack each other. Despite Stalin's deep distrust of everyone, he placed his trust in Hitler. This seemed contradictory, as Stalin saw Hitler as a strong leader and believed that a Soviet-German alliance would be unbeatable. Even after the fall of France in 1940, Stalin still believed the Soviet Union was secure, thinking that Hitler would not wage war on 2 fronts at the same time. We can understand Hitler's actions with normal logic. In the summer of 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, sending Nazi tanks toward Moscow. Within the first week, over 100,000 Soviet troops were captured. Suddenly, Hitler's armored units sliced into the Soviet Union like a knife, and the supreme leader, Joseph Stalin, was shocked. He retreated to a villa outside Moscow and refused to speak, fearing an attack from his opponents. He stayed inside for 3 weeks. His deputy dared to approach him and reported the urgency of the situation, saying the Germans were close to Moscow. Stalin emerged from the villa, intervened in the war, and ordered the execution of any generals or soldiers who retreated. Stalin's son Yakov, fighting at the front, was captured by the Germans, who wanted to exchange him for a German general. Stalin refused, saying he would not trade a general for a soldier. Yakov ultimately died after touching an electrified fence. Except for the Mongols, all armies that invaded Russia made a common mistake. They didn't believe in weather forecasts. Both Napoleon and Hitler were like this. Thus, General January and General February became the strongest commanders in the Russian army. The Soviet forces gradually pushed the Nazis out of Soviet territory. On May 2, 1945, Soviet forces captured Berlin, and World War II ended. While some credit Stalin's leadership for the victory, I believe that the harsh winter and the bravery of Soviet soldiers were the real turning points. This was followed by the Cold War era. On March 1, 1953, this father of the nation was alone in his room, drinking heavily, seemingly having suffered a heart attack. He collapsed on the sofa and lay there for almost a day, with no one daring to enter his room or disturb him. Finally, his deputy went in and found Stalin's face already blue, but no one dared to touch his body. They stood there, terrified, staring at the corpse. A cleaning woman entered, pushing her way through the crowd, saying, "Let me do it." She tried to perform CPR, but it was in vain. When the news spread, the Soviet Union fell into mourning, and many couldn't believe that Stalin, the beloved father, had passed away. His body was displayed in Moscow for 3 days, with millions of people queuing to pay their respects. The victory in World War II pushed Stalin's personality cult to its peak, and people seemed to see the end of the world. Stalin's propaganda had turned him into the embodiment of all things good, but the more perfect the image, the more unbearable the truth when it was exposed. In his eyes, human freedom and life were meaningless. At his funeral, 500 people were crushed to death by frenzied mourners. To this day, some people continue to remember him fondly, calling him a fatherly figure. These people are the classic examples of those who only remember the rewards, not the punishments. How could a man so cruel to his own people be kind to others? Some even try to excuse him, arguing that despite his flaws, he led the Soviet Union to achieve many successes. This view is like claiming that killing someone can bring honor, and thus killing someone isn't a crime. It's utterly absurd. A person is an independent being, a living life. Only by respecting life can we continue discussing other matters.